Hello everyone and welcome to today's Connect conversation. My name is Aidan Shue and I'm Head of Systematic Trading International at Citadel Securities, and today I'm delighted to welcome Parag Khanna to join us in this conversation. Dr. Parag Khanna is a leading global strategy advisor, world traveler and best-selling author. He's the founder and CEO of Climate Alpha, an AI-powered analytics platform that future-proofs global investments, and founder and managing partner of FutureMap, a data and scenario-based strategic advisory firm. Dr. Khanna holds a PhD in International Relations from the London School of Economics and bachelor's and master's degrees from Georgetown University. Parag has been honored as a young global leader of World Economic Forum and has served on the Global Future Council on Mobility, Global Agenda Council on Geoeconomics, and advisory board of its Future of Urban Development initiative. Wow. Not sure about you guys, but I feel a little bit of an underachiever after that introduction. But I'm truly thrilled to lead this conversation today. As you might have picked up, I'm Irish born, where I lived most of my childhood, but my heritage extends beyond the Emerald Isle. My father was born in Taiwan to Chinese parents. Taiwan's a place I spent 4 memorable years, of my childhood. My grandparents' journey is quite a tale. They left China for Taiwan at the start of the Chinese Civil War. And due to the tensions and ongoing war, they did not return to their homeland for over 4 decades, unfortunately, not getting a chance to see their parents again. My own father, traveled to Europe as a young man to study and explore new horizons, and also that's where he met my mother. And then now I also travel with my family to Asia, although in much different circumstance, I can imagine, to what they would have experienced 35 years ago. And as I look across the room and think about our community, there must be many people with similar stories and connections that makes the conversation today deeply meaningful. So thank you for joining us. Parag, thank you again. I think we should begin this conversation by talking about your personal story and understand a bit more about your background. As I understand it, you were born in India, grew up in the UAE, Germany, and New York, and then, as I said, studied in Washington, D.C. and London. You speak English, German, Hindi, French, Spanish, and some Arabic. And I also learned that you have traveled to some 150 countries around the world. So what are some of the most memorable journeys or valuable lessons that you've learned so far?
Well, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here, and thank you for allowing me to join you this evening. And I love the context for this conversation. All of us do have migration in our background. It's literally the story of being human. As I like to say, to move is human, right? And that goes back literally well over 100,000 years. And more than people realize, migration is thought of as just a privilege, but it is in fact a mass phenomenon even today. Just one data point, before or during COVID, borders closed, right? It was the great lockdown. People said no one will ever travel again, and we didn't know when the lockdown would end. But just 1 year after COVID, we're back to record levels of international migration and movement. So it is really intrinsically, it is who we are. Certainly part of my story. So yes, India, UAE, US, Germany, a few other places in between, all around circulating, but wound up here in this great global hub of Singapore. But memorable experiences, I mean, there are some that are short duration. I think, being in the right place at the right time or going to the right place at the right time maybe is one of the things that I've been fortunate enough to do, and not always actively, but passively. We spoke earlier. When I turned 12, the Berlin Wall fell. We'd already moved to America, so I was living in New York, and it was November 9th, 1989. Within a couple of weeks, my father had hastily arranged a holiday and pulled my brother and me out of school, and we flew to Frankfurt, drove for hours, got to Berlin. So there I was within a couple of weeks of this most monumental, kind of occasion. So I got to sit on the wall, climb on the wall, hack away at the wall, gather Ziploc bags of the wall and pack them and bring them home. So that was just a couple of days, but everything in my life has just been a footnote, to that experience that was so incredibly, life altering. But I've had some great journeys. The way I live my life is to travel, and I was just raised that way. So everyone has, their parents blessed them with something or the other. And in my case, it was just taking me everywhere. And so now that's how I roll. That's how my kids, also get to experience the world. But about 12 years ago, we decided to participate in something called the Ambulance to Mongolia, the Mongol charity rally. So we bought a beat-up old British surplus army truck, a 3-ton hulking Land Rover, not a fancy kind that Singapore's high and mighty drive, and we drove it from an army base in the Midlands and all the way to Mongolia, which is 13,000 kilometers with the steering wheel, to be clear, on the right, in countries that as soon as you get out of the tunnel, drive on the right. So, but we did it. That's just one. I mean, I've driven across China, through Tibet and Xinjiang, back before there were roads there. And to me, every one of those travels is just unforgettable. So the joke is that my life has been about getting other people to pay for my travel. So, nice. mission accomplished.
Yeah, great. And I know you now, live settled in Singapore. Is there somewhere that you feel most at home, and or you embrace the identity of a global citizen?
That's a great question. So definitely the idea of global citizenship, whose definition and connotations certainly change over time. I embrace most understandings of the term for sure. If you have kids who go to school here, local or international, you see that it's infiltrating the curriculum, right, in a good way, right? So the IB program is proliferating everywhere, and global citizenship is part of that. But to me, and I think this is very important for anyone who's a migrant, is to think of identity as something that is cumulative, not substitutive, right? So you're actually a third culture kid, according to the strict definition of it, a child of mixed race heritage. I'm a child of singular heritage. I'm an ethnic Punjabi, and that's all I am. Although I took a DNA swab, by the way, and I have Greek, I have Mediterranean and Baltic heritage too, but you can't quite, it's not biographical, it's just genetic. But to me, I still feel Indian. I love the United Arab Emirates in a way that only someone who's lived there as a child can just say, God, it's just amazing warmth, to this place and the society that foreigners will never quite understand. They think of it as just a superficial, glitzy party town. I'm very American, as you can hear. I mean, I'm a New Yorker through and through. I know exactly where to get the best pizza. I know everything about New York. I know every street sign. I've even stolen street signs. I'm a true New Yorker. I guess most interestingly for me, I'm completely German, right? I go to Germany, and everyone in Germany treats me like a German, from politicians who I know to a taxi driver. I'm completely functionally German in every possible way. Berlin is a place where you could drop me any day of the week. From the time, as I told you before, since the time I was 12, I went to high school there. I finished school, I studied in university there. I've lived there off and on for the last 30 years. You're not going to look at me and say, oh, that guy's German. But Germans say I'm more German than they are. I'm so incredibly demanding that people don't use English words when they're speaking German, because in a lot of linguistic modern cultures today, you just kind of import English words for everything. The French, as you know, are famously against it. Germans are way more lax. So I'm strict with the Germans that they speak proper German. And so, nothing about me biologically is German. But so is there a place, what I love about Singapore is that it is part of the Singapore story. It's modern story for sure, that is unbelievably diverse. And this is statistically true, right? This is the most religiously, one of the most racially diverse countries in the world, highest rate of intermarriage in the entire world. All of these accolades, these are all true. So global cities are where I feel most at home. So if you think about the comments of New York, Berlin, London, where I've lived as well, Singapore, Dubai, what do they have in common? These are the cities that have the highest proportion of foreign-born residents of just about any other cities in the world. So I'm always going to feel home in a place like that, and all of them. And the good news is the world is becoming like that. No matter how much xenophobia, populism, protectionism, racism, border controls, that's what you hear. It's also partially happening, but the waves of migration overwhelm all of that. Otherwise, we would not be in the situation where so many places are so incredibly diverse, right? So, I think the world is heading in that direction.
Great. Now, you've authored many books, one of those being Move, The Forces Uprooting Us. In that, you challenge the long-standing belief that geography is destiny, right? And which implies that one's birthplace predominantly sets their life trajectory. So, given the increasing global connectivity, yet growing economic disparities, do you believe this adage still holds true or is becoming more or less relevant?
So people used to say geography is destiny, then demography is destiny. And I've twice modified these axioms. The first is to say, well, connectivity is destiny. If you look at, again, this 100,000-year history of humanity, what have we done? Well, people, as we have proliferated in number, have congregated into cities, right? We are an urban species now, primarily. And we've built connectivity between those cities. We are literally a connected urban civilization as much as we are states and borders, right? So connectivity is destiny and mobility is destiny because, again, record levels of migration. More people cross borders every single year than ever in history, over 1 billion people. That's voluntary and involuntary. More people live outside their country of origin than ever before, right? It's still a relatively small share of the total human population, right? Say 3.5%. But the world population has quadrupled in the last 100 years. So more numerically, this is one of those things where you want to be looking at the absolute number rather than the relative number. The absolute number of people who have moved, have relocated permanently is staggeringly larger than at any other point in history, and it's only going to grow. So is that destiny? It absolutely is. It is the teleological arc, of human life, is connectivity and mobility.
Okay, great, thank you. And as we navigate the aftermath of the COVID pandemic and reflect on the global connectivity that you talk about and the themes you mentioned are highlighted in connectography, how do you foresee its impact on the global supply chain, migration trends and urban development? How do you believe these changes could reshape the global geopolitical balance of power?
It's a great question, and the way you framed it is very important because you listed a range of macro drivers, right? You have geopolitical tensions, you have new investment patterns, supply chain shifts, war for talent. The geopolitical balance of power is in some ways a residual. It is the result of how all of those trends play out. Industrial policy, if you look at the last 500 years of rise and decline of empires, right, there is actually a familiar pattern. It starts with industrial policies, right? Import substitution practices, competition in critical industrial sectors, building up trade surpluses, currency reserves, investing in your own modernization, military expansion, and so forth. That is literally the arc. A lot of people look at China over the last 40 years and they say something utterly sui generis, and it's not. It begins in the industrial policy of the 1970s in the same way that tensions between Spain and Portugal and Spain and the Dutch and the British, and so on and so forth. Every single empire, the American too, let us not forget, right? And if you don't know about Alexander Hamilton, but maybe you've seen the play, this is a theme, right? So every country, actually every empire has a similar story in its rise. That, plus of course immigration, being open to talent, technological innovation, and so on and so on. So those ingredients are what drive what we observe when we say the world has become multipolar, right? Because it's the result of supply chains, industry, military might, currency reserves concentrating in places. Now, this is where you have an open debate. Is the world actually multipolar? And if so, how much so, and so forth? And some will say, well, when it comes to, global military reach capabilities, it's still very hierarchical. When it comes to the economic landscape, it's more diverse. But in the monetary arena, it's still more concentrated. When it comes to, obviously, demographics, it's more Asian, and so on and so on. IP in one way. Ultimately, it's all of those things, and you can choose to weight and aggregate these factors in different ways. This is what geopolitical theory is actually about. Geopolitical theory is actually not about gray bearded men sitting in salons and drinking scotch and drawing on maps. It is actually as mathematical as international relations gets. Is what is the formula that you use to calculate what you think is the power balance in the world? I studied this stuff in college, and it was not fun. But ultimately, whatever there are different forms, there's almost a menu of schools of thought and options you choose from. But I think today you would say, whichever weighting you choose, the world is quite multipolar. I'll give you an example, just one. After World War II, 1945, what share of the world economy did the United States represent? Anyone? 50%, 50, fully half of the entire world economy. Now, you've had a lot of people saying, particularly in the last 15 years, China is going to displace America and be the sole global superpower, and look at its economic growth and its staggering demographic size and its Belt and Road Initiative and so on and so on and so on. What share of the world economy does China represent today? 15%, 15. Now, there is no global hegemony under a single power that is only 15% of global GDP. Not at all. How many $1 trillion economies adjusted for inflation were there in 1945? One or two, right? Today there's about a dozen, right? So we do live in a distributed. How many nuclear weapon states are there? Not just one, not just two. Again, over 10. So in most spheres of life that matter, that you can calculate, right? You would say the world is in aggregate quite multipolar. So it's a multipolar world. The U.S., a U.S.-centric North America, a Germany, EU-centric kind of whatever, European Commonwealth space, and Asia being so much larger demographically and in terms of civilizational diversity than any other part of the world. Asia is a multipolar region in a multipolar world. Right? It's a microcosm of the world because you have China, you have Japan, you have India, you have Southeast Asia trying to coalesce, and other Asian powers writ large. So if you really want to embrace, the complexity of today's world geopolitically, you would not use reductionist kinds of formulas like is it US, is it China? Is it a new Cold War and, that's going to be one against the other in perpetuity and they're going to carve up the planet? That's not true. It's just matter of fact. It's not true today, and it becomes less true even into the future. Right. So personally, based on the methodologies that I prefer and use, the observations that I've made, the diplomatic behavior that I observe and quite frankly advise governments and how they participate in, the world is irrevocably becoming multipolar. And I personally think that is actually a good thing. Powers keep each other honest. Right. And they're allowed to engage in very dynamic kinds of hedging, checking, balancing behavior, right, that they wouldn't otherwise be able to do. And so simply because you cannot put the genie back in the bottle is reason enough to just be realistic and to accept and therefore even embrace to some degree multipolarity.
Okay, and this multipolar world order you talk about, is there, recent BRICS expansion? Do you see that as accelerating this view of the future?
So it's a symptom of it, not a cause of it. The distribution of power and the empowerment psychologically and materially that bestows upon many countries in the world, from Brazil to Saudi Arabia to Russia to Australia to India and so on, that is the underlying driver. As that occurs and countries grow comfortable in their new skin and they start to assert themselves and reach out and build their own relations with themselves at the center of their own universe, right? Saying, what, I know that China is more powerful than me, but I, as Indonesia, I'm going to multi-align. I'm going to practice this subtle art of having investment and trade with China, but also with Japan and certainly with America. I'll be part of the Quad Plus strategic framework with the United States. And then things like the BRICS emerge, where you have a pretty much uncorrelated set of countries that don't really act economically or diplomatically in tandem, kind of coming together just to explore things. And then it becomes BRICS plus 6 and BRICS plus 20, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, so many of these frameworks. And I think that's great. That's great what they're doing. Ultimately, functionally, what they're doing is exploring complementarities, right? Can you launch my satellites for cheaper than that country? Can you build my 5G internet for cheaper than that country? Can I buy oil and gas from you and food from you, and so on and so on and so on. And that is all part of this process of building a networked world. Would you rather not have a networked world? And so this is a consequence of the physical and digital and financial connectivity infrastructure that we have been relentlessly building over the past 100 years.
Okay. And this growing influence, or Asia-centric world order, what are the main drivers of that?
Yeah.
Is it geography, human capital, or sheer military might?
Well, for one thing, we should clarify what I mean by Asia. I'm sufficiently trained in geography that I can speak on behalf of geographers. The definition of Asia is not just China. Let's be clear, and it's not just Greater China. Asia, in formal geography, is from the Mediterranean Sea to the Sea of Japan, and it's from Russia down to Australasia, right? To be clear, that is Asia. That has always been Asia, and that always will be Asia. And that's the definition of Asia that I use. Now, when I make maps, when I practice cartography and work with GIS, map makers, and for my books, we wind up having to take, sort of and bend and contort and recut, maps to fit this definition, because we've been so culturally kind of skewed towards thinking of Asia as just East Asia. But that's the full Asia. Now, after 5 centuries of colonialism and Cold War, you have Asian countries able to rekindle their ties that they enjoyed in the pre-colonial world. The pre-colonial world, there are historians and sociologists who look at the kind of trade routes of the ancient Silk Roads and so forth, the pre-colonial world of the 13th, 14th, 15th centuries. The term that is used for the dominant geographical paradigm is Afro-Eurasia. Africa, Europe, Asia. The terrestrial Silk Routes and the Indian Ocean maritime corridors. What better term is there to describe the center of gravity and the dynamics among those centers of gravity in the year 2023 than Afro-Eurasia? And if you're not participating in the physical, digital, financial networks that are increasingly stitching together, again, this Afro-Eurasian realm, you might be pessimistic about globalization. But if you are anywhere in that Afro-Eurasian theory, which is the vast majority of the geography of the planet, the vast majority of the population of the world, you don't really hear anti-globalization, right? That would be a farce. So we're living in this incredible revitalization, renaissance of the Afro-Eurasian system, with the added benefit of the Western Hemisphere, North America, South America, actively trying to get their hands on it and get their claws into it to be part of it. Otherwise, they would be cut off from the great interregional patterns that are rekindling today and have been since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Right? So we are only a couple of decades into this enormous new wave, you might even say, of new building of connectivity. And Asians, because of the demographics, because of the proximity, because of the kind of desire to modernize, that's how they have so relentlessly pursued this agenda. And these societies in Asia that, again, that I've listed earlier, this incredibly rich, variegated region, despite all the linguistic and cultural obstacles, has found it, has achieved this incredible convergence, where you have Asians trading more with Asian countries than outside of Asia, more capital flows within Asia than outside of Asia. All of this, complementarity has been rediscovered in such a short period of time, and it's really just the beginning. So I'm quite bullish on the macro Asian story. Again, most of humanity lives in Asia and always will. Most of the infrastructure investment is in Asia, consumption, middle class, everything. you can have disruptions to the story, and you can have weak links in the chain, and there are many. But the overall picture, you have to take the big picture view and say that you're just literally in the early innings of this Asian centricity.
Okay. And as you said, China's only part of the Asia story.
Correct.
But in your opinion, which countries do you think are underrepresented or underrated in Asia?
So there's the countries and there's the system. To be clear, the system dynamics of Asia coming together are part of what uplift the players in the system, right? And this is very, very important to explain. Let me make it more concrete. Asia's modern rise, people would attribute in the post-war period to Japan. Japan as the kind of phoenix rising from the ashes. By 1975, Japan was already the world's second largest economy. It had overtaken West Germany at the time. And of course, people talked about the Japanese threat, at least in the West, and so on, right? Then you had the tiger economies kind of coinciding with that. And then you had China come as the third wave. So Japan, the tigers, China. Now, how did the tigers look to Japan? China looked to the tigers and to Japan. And now you have the fourth wave of growth, right, which is South and Southeast Asia, which is looking, of course, to China and to the tigers and to Japan. And who are the largest trading partners and investors across these four waves of growth? Well, it's each other. And this is not an unfamiliar pattern. Older, mature, and modern advanced economies will increasingly look to proximate, lower cost, populous, low wage, production centers. And that's how you explain Eastern Europe, right? Its rise in the last couple of decades. And that's what first wave Asia and tiger Asia is doing to fourth wave Asia. And so that's what's happening here. And so then you can't explain India's rapid ascent and ASEAN too without fitting it into a paradigm. Rather than say, Asia is these blocks. You've got your Japanese block and it rivals the China block and the India block. No, Asia is a sponge, right? It's a sponge, and it has been for 4,000 years, to be clear, right? But it's a more porous sponge than it has been in a long, long time. So again, despite the geopolitical tensions, right? You still have the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the largest regional trade framework in the entire world, right? You have China having ASEAN as its second largest trading partner behind the European Union. You have India with its Look East policy, and so on and so on and so on. So, you have to embrace the paradox in a way of the fact that you have historical geopolitical tensions that could materialize at any time while still having this deep, deep accelerating convergence.
Okay, thank you. And in the context of China, if we focus on the military tensions with Taiwan, strengthening ties with Russia, how do these actions hinder China's influence on the global stage?
No, this is fascinating. Now, I would like to call you out in the way you frame the question, which of course is perfectly normal, right? Say, look, we have expectations. We have expectations that, given the common perception that we have that what Russia has done is way beyond the pale and needs to be confronted, and therefore we have expectations that democratic societies and that allied countries or soft allied countries like like Japan and India are going to buy into and sign on to sanctions against Russia and so forth. China, we can sort of understand, they have this tacit alliance and so forth, but in reality, most of Asia has kind of embraced Russia, right, to be clear, not just China, right? Japan has been exempted from the oil cap, to be clear, right? India has called for a north-south Silk Road, right, to Russia in the height of the Western push to isolate and sanction Russia. You can predict a lot about a country's foreign policy by looking at the share of its trade deficit, that's accounted for, or the increase in its trade deficit accounted for by high energy imports, right? You could blindfold me and just tell me what is happening in a country's trade balance and energy prices, and what pressure that puts on domestic subsidies, And I will, with 100% accuracy, predict their foreign policy, right? And India is exhibit A in that regard. It doesn't care that it has a budding, some would say strategic alliance with the United States. It knows that it can get away with a commodities-friendly, focused foreign policy vis-a-vis Russia. And that's exactly what it's going to do. And so, sure, Putin's not going to get on a plane. He didn't show up, at either the BRICS summit in South Africa nor at the G20 in New Delhi. He did make it to the North Korean border or something like that relatively recently. But let's be clear, Asians have this very pragmatic and, I don't want to say apolitical, that's not true. It's incredibly opportunistic, right, and shrewd approach to policy. But it is not ever going to, and again, this is what I meant earlier about positionalism, countries putting themselves at the center, saying, I'm going to do what's in my best interest. I'm never going to bow down to a hegemonic power and one that's going to pressure me based on norms, and so forth. And so only when you fully embrace almost the aggressive way in which I'm describing this Asian mentality of self-interested behavior, only then will you appreciate that Asia's not going to play ball. They're going to do their thing. So the notion that China wants to be perceived in a more positive light and atone for, make up for the excessively aggressive stance that it has taken vis-a-vis Taiwan, South China Sea, alienating neighbors, debt trap diplomacy, it needs to make good. That is not the way Beijing is thinking. That is not even the expectation that other Asians have of China. It is a think tank study, basically, written in Washington. And I used to sit in think tanks in Washington and write those studies. And then I started traveling. and it really disabused me. So anytime we ever talk about any other country, always put yourself in their shoes and add a full meter of heels to those shoes. And everyone right now is feeling, what's in it for me, even the smallest power. And that's the world we live in right now.
Wow. Okay. And what are the key implications of that on the financial markets? Where do you see the greatest risks or opportunities?
Well, I mean, fortunately, in finance and economics, there are rules, right? You can't punch too far above your weight. There are conditioning factors and there's corrections. And I think that discipline is important. And I say this because for those who are too young to remember terms like Washington consensus and so forth, it turns out that certain amounts of structural adjustment and market discipline and, privatization and restructuring and transparency and reform and, loosening capital controls, those are not bad things, right? So actually there is a playbook that pragmatic countries follow. What I do like about Asia, and this is where BRICS falls apart, by the way, when I said these are uncorrelated, that's a very truthful statement. I mean, there's Asian emerging markets, and then there's the rest of the world. And if you look at any, obviously, any of the MSCI or whatever public market kind of, index you want to look at, other EMs drag Asia down, right, to be clear. And Asian emerging markets have inflation under control and have healthy, either surpluses or certainly strong, fiscal position, high savings, strong infrastructure investment. All of the kind of tailwinds are there in Asia. Other EMs, including those who consort in these, diplomatic confabs like South Africa, Nigeria, Turkey, Brazil, these are not exactly desirable investment destinations right now, right? Unless you're chasing, super high interest rates, right? So again, this is the geographer in me again. There is a gravity, right? The Asian systemic gravity has helped to elevate Asian participants. If you are not part of that, it shows because there is no cushion for you, right? Right now, I've been to South Africa a couple times recently. Not exactly a place I'm going to put any money, right? So you've got Asian markets, and you've got those that have not made counter-cyclical investments, which is one of the strongest fiscal indicators that I'm always looking for. That quite frankly, anyone who's an emerging market economist is going to look and see, look, when the going was good and commodities prices were high, did you diversify your economy? Did you invest in infrastructure, social policy? Well, South Africa, Brazil, Russia. So, I'm a believer in bringing those two factors together, the geographical and the economic, and of course the political. I'm a political scientist. I study regimes. I want to see pragmatism that transcends administrations. And that's, again, something you see in Asia in the kind of technocratic push or leaning that we have in this region, even in the democratic states. So again, that's where you see the stars materially aligning, right? Not just the world of ideas, but the material execution is happening in Asia.
Okay. Now, if we shift gears a little bit, it seems like you can't have a discussion in 2023 without talking about artificial intelligence. Right. So how do emerging technologies like AI that you're very close to, how will they influence the world order going forward?
Well, I think, first of all, just technology itself is a driving force. The balance of innovation, this is what we were sort of touching on earlier. It's the balance of innovation that drives the balance of power, not the reverse, right? Again, the balance of power is a residual, right? The balance of innovation is the driver. And so AI, and in geopolitical theory even, there's a school of thought called leading sector theory. And it's always looking at what is the cluster of technologies in any given era which confers greater power systemically on those who control its innovation, deployment, and so on. So obviously, biotech and materials and AI and other sectors, fall into that leading sector cluster of our era, of our time. So AI is very, very significant. The efficiencies that it brings, the scale it enables, the profits that can generate, obviously the impact it has then, downstream, obviously in restructuring in a way markets and delivering, especially in the consumer space, but in many areas, obviously in Internet of Things, manufacturing too. AI is being used everywhere at this point. And look, another caveat almost is to point out that technologies actually do diffuse a lot faster than people think. It's like, well, I control nuclear weapons for now, but that spread very quickly. Look at AI. It's pointless to have ever said, who will control AI? Well, the answer is, again, within a year, you've got AI companies, AI unicorns all over the world. And they can offer their AI as a service on a platform basis globally, very, very cheap. So there is no one power controlling AI. So on the one hand, you have the leading sector theory and the clusters of technologies and attempting to superimpose that on specific geographies and powers at a time when technology is diffusing more rapidly than ever before, and you have to reconcile those two things in your head in a way. So I'm an AI sort of optimist. Let's be clear about that. There's a couple of Silicon Valley executives who signed a declaration calling for the regulation of AI, but with the caveat that their own machinations would be exempted. Don't pay attention to any of that. The relentless pace of innovation, lays or kind of lays waste to the most attempts at noble kind of regulation. So I'm an AI optimist. I think it's going to do more good than harm, but the divide will be countries that manage the social, consequences and fallout. Because, of course, if you have large-scale unemployment, it's going to be a question of, well, which countries have those, utilitarian, welfare-oriented policies that are going to redistribute gains or at least, compensate workers, or of course redirect them towards other professions. And one of the key things to remember is that things that are not yet automated are the things that humans do in the non-tradable services economy, right? We do things for each other. Schools, construction, just again, the healthcare. Yes, there is AI present in these arenas, but these are still very labor-intensive areas of the economy, right? And therefore, if we paid people more, what they're worth, for these areas of the economy where humans actually engage in labor, for each other in the services economy, you wouldn't necessarily have large-scale unemployment. And the money is there to pay people what they deserve, right? And if you were to do that, you could also avoid some of the political fallout and backlash and let's call them unintended consequences in terms of large-scale inequality, though it's not necessarily unintended in some ways. It's by design in some areas. But so I think I don't want to say we. I think some countries will get it right, other countries won't, right? I mean, in a way, I travel and study countries and I look for the weaknesses and the strengths, and who's managing global processes and cross currents better than others. And those that do will thrive and prosper, whether it is AI and technological disruption or whether it's climate change, right? So to me, the world is 200 countries, and you have global systemic kinds of macro trends, and you have domestic forces and capabilities and capacity. And it's where those come together where we're constantly recalibrating the pecking order of success and failure. And this will not end. There is no new stable equilibrium coming anytime soon. Every country is going to be fighting to stay afloat and thrive and stay ahead of these waves. And so I'm judging and ranking and measuring. And so what I do is geographical arbitrage, right, in a way. Whether it's not my own life, where do I choose to live and travel, or whether I'm going to be long, short, in certain markets, it's geographical arbitrage. And this question that you're asking is just one of the variables that I'm considering.
Right, great. Thank you for sharing that. Lastly, I guess, do you have any advice for our team members developing their careers in a rapidly changing world? And then what's the best career or life advice you've ever been given?
Well, okay, so my wife gets credit for this one. She used to say, or everyone used to say, there are two global languages, right, English and Chinese. But she is sort of famously or infamously said, no, there are two global languages, English and code, right? So, if you don't know how to code, it's not too late. Even I'm trying, or at least, passively. Or you might even sort of distill that further and just say English and math, right, or the two global languages. But I'm gathering everyone in this room is very, very good at math. So no need to worry on that score. My more generic advice, is around mobility. Again, this geographical arbitrage. And this is, again, not for those who have the good fortune as we do to really choose where we live, but we're entering a time when the world population is primarily young people, by the way, not old people. And of course, we talk about demographics and global aging, but again, fact, right? 6 billion people in the world are young, under the age of 40, right? And of course, so when I'm looking at young people, I'm saying you don't necessarily know where geography, where you are going to need to be, where your skills will be needed, where there will be demand, right? Where will be stable, where will be climate resilient. You don't necessarily know. So be mobile, be prepared to go to those places. The work may not come to you. The work may be taken away from you, as we've witnessed with deindustrialization processes that have occurred over the last decades. And those who are immobile, physically immobile, are the ones who lose out. And so this is richly documented in America and in modern America, where we look at income mobility by the zip code level, the postal code level, over generations, and we see that the surest path, and this is true globally, quite frankly, and it brings us full circle. The surest path to economic mobility is not handouts where you are when you're stuck in place. The surest, absolute surest path to economic mobility is a physical mobility. Go to where the opportunity is. And where did we begin? With migration, right? All of our families at some point or the other moved from one place to another for that better life. It doesn't mean the world's going to be borderless. We have more borders than any other time in history by a lot. And yet we also have a world in which mobility, thanks to connectivity and digital connectivity, physical and digital, mobility in many senses of the term is more possible than ever before. Again, another paradox, but it is true.
Right. Thanks so much. This has been a terrific discussion. I think some of our team members probably have some questions of their own, so we should open up to the floor. For colleagues who are joined online, please submit your questions via Slido, but let's start with the room here. If you can remain seated when asking the questions and wait for someone to hand you one of the microphones so we can hear you clearly. Thanks. Yeah, Rohit.
Hi, my name is Rohit. I want to ask you, how do you feel the education system is changing since in the last 10, 20 years, especially related to STEM, like science, technology, maths? And do you think Asia is better, more dominating in US? And what is the trajectory going forward?
Right. It's a great question. It's hard to generalize. One looks country by country at things like this. So percentage of STEM graduates, or what age are they, or number of STEM graduates, even the absolute number per country. What are their own labor shortages in that domain? And do they have the immigration policies to compensate for that shortfall, even if their own numbers are increasing? Those kinds of things. So math, sure, is strong in Asia, one would say, but that doesn't mean that all science, and technology education is. Sort of basic foundations are pretty strong in European countries too, but they haven't invested in technology at all. You've got so many, societies with slow internet speed, slow broadband speed, and that's obviously a huge kind of gap again in those countries. So no place has it necessarily perfect. But I think the better answer to this is what I call economic master planning. The phrase master plan is used in architecture, right, and in urban studies. What's the master plan? Singapore has a master plan for the year 2035. Where will the MRT stations be, the industrial parks, and so on. But there's no point in a spatial master plan without an economic master plan. What will be my society's role and node in the global division of labor, of industries and supply chains, knowledge economy, goods economy, and so forth? Only once you have planned 5 to 10 years ahead to know what your niche will be in the global division of labor, then you reverse engineer from that. Well, which companies do I need to have here? Which industries do I need to stimulate, right? What will be the public-private partnerships? How am I going to allocate my subsidies? Where are the workers going to come from for that sector? Do I have them? Do I need to import them? What curricula am I teaching in the schools to ensure that adequate supply for those sectors? And am I educating for them now? What am I going to teach? That is economic master planning. How many countries can you count that do that rigorously? You can fit on one hand, right? And that's a problem. And that's why you see so many countries flailing and falling behind. Now, I said countries, but I really actually mean cities, right? And this is to be very, very clear, right? Because even within countries, cities compete with each other, and they do internationally as well. So I really look very, very granular at this kind of thing, and it's a city level thing. But countries that have practiced this economic master planning in a proactive way, going back multiple generations, but not always gotten it right, but certainly have a habit, a cultured habit of doing it, are Japan and Korea and Switzerland, to some degree Germany, and so forth. And what if there's a silver lining, it's learning effects. So even countries that haven't done it well are observing countries that have done it, and therefore they're learning to get in on the game and to do it too. And that to me is a positive sign.
Great. We'll take one from the one that's been submitted on the Slido. How can Western countries best adapt and collaborate with the rising Asian economies?
Mm-hmm. Well, they don't have a choice, to be clear. And this is, I'm going to drive this point home, even though we're mostly Asians here in Asia. But for anyone in the rest of the world, I've been living here 10 years. I was born here. I've been traveling around the region for 25 years. Of the 5 billion people of Asia, I've never met a single one of those 5 billion people who wakes up saying, I really care what people in London or Washington or New York think. Mm-hmm. Like never has that sentence been uttered in the last 25 years. So I think the question, that has to hit home. I think people in Western economies, in Western societies, decision makers need to wake up and say, how can I be relevant to them, mm-hmm. right? One of the punchlines of my Asia book is, Asia used to make for the world, now the world makes for Asia, right? Or Asia used to make for the West, now the West makes for Asia, right? And you can see that in the product adaptation and marketing and so forth. So all of that being true, what you can see is that, when the US, for example, pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement, which is something that, Obama couldn't get over the line and Trump killed anyway, and they come back with a very tepid set of policies that appeal to a subset of Asian countries in a purely functional level, that doesn't really add up to as much. If I could boil it down to one phrase, it would be put your money where your mouth is. and this is an operating principle. Really, Asians are pragmatic. No one wants to hear just talk, right? It's put your money where your mouth is. My advice to anyone who wants to be relevant in Asia is put your money where your mouth is. So locate your facilities here, open your offices here, train management here, relocate operations and so forth here in order to be relevant to Asia. It's the only way to be relevant to Asia in that sense. And that's really critical. And that's where I think the US actually thrives in one sense. Again, foreign investment, American foreign investment in Asia is very, very significant, even when trade agreements fall, or precisely because they do, because then, of course, you need to get behind the tariff wall. And so you need to increase your presence. So and one of the things I've noticed is that in the last 10 years, European firms, right, go to, if you've seen it, way out in Jurong, there's the Germany House, right? It's got a little stripes, the German flag there on the building. Its occupancy is like double, tripled. The number of German small and medium enterprises, Mittelstand as they're known, that have incorporated here has gone through the roof. German delegations. Now the same thing for the French and the Austrians and Italians, Scandinavians, all increasing. They are putting their roots down here, right? So that's the shortest, simplest, sweetest. If you anything else you do is a distant fourth priority compared to that.
Right.
If you don't do that, it just doesn't matter.
Right.
You have to be here.
Absolutely. Anyone else in the room have a question? No? Okay, we'll go back to Slido. I guess here's anything you can share about your new book, Citizens of Everywhere, The Education of a Globalist?
Well, only that it's been delayed, even though it's written, because I have no time. Now that I run a software company, suddenly I don't have those, bucolic or, mornings. COVID was a great time if you were here in Singapore and, had a nice terrace, woke up early, didn't have to travel, no jet lag, wake up for the kids and write, and think a bit too. So I got most of that book done, but a couple of things. One is that move about human geography, because of the triggers of human mobility today, whether it is the Ukraine war, Russian invasion of Ukraine and the refugee crisis there, or climate migration, which is becoming a thing. That's what that book was about. So that book is still, for me, the one that's alive, in many ways. And Climate Alpha was born out of that book. So I'm still living that. Citizens of Everywhere is autobiographical, and it's also in a way a work of cosmopolitan political theory, which is sort of an area that was related to my doctoral work, and inspired by the faculty I worked with at the time. So I'm kind of writing it as something that I would want to see taught in IB classes for high schoolers, or in maybe political theory classes in college. And there's no rush in a way. So what I can tell you is that it's autobiographical. It tracks to my being a citizen of everywhere, and feeling, as I said, that identity is cumulative, not substitutive. And it's also my take on this idea of global citizenship, which in many Western contexts, or just about everywhere, is viewed as something that is ethereal and remote and disconnected and rootless, and this is what Theresa May made famous in one of her parting shots when she was prime minister. She said, if you're a citizen of everywhere, you're a citizen of nowhere, right? And I think she's wrong about that, right? And it was very ironic for someone in the UK to be saying that, given what the capital flight of British citizens after Brexit and so on. But leaving that aside, I'm seeking to reconcile these discourses and to speak to the world's youth, as I mentioned earlier. If you are a parochial, elderly, myopic person in your 70s, 80s, 90s in a Western European country or in a homogenous community in the United States, I have some bad news. You're not my audience. You're just not. I mean, you'll buy my book anyway, great. But you're not my audience, right? I wrote this book for the 6 billion people who are age 40 and younger. And with them, I know that it's pushing on an open door. In many ways, I'm telling them something they already know and feel, but I'm just putting a nice theoretical evolution framework around it and saying, I have been fortunate enough to have lived this life that's brought me to these conclusions. And I see those lives actually moving in very similar directions because I've been traveling and talking to people younger than me for the last 20 plus years. So that's the story in a way. That's the meta narrative. But one last word, it's my 8th book. It's all one long stream of consciousness. It's just that you're not allowed to publish 3,000 pages of any book. So at some point in the last 7 books, what happens is the editors just cut me off and say, you're just done. And then I take what I was working on and what logically comes next, but there's no space for, and I build the next one and the next one, the next one. So it is one long stream of consciousness.
Great. Okay, well, thanks again. Thank you for all the insightful questions. Thanks again to Parag for joining in this conversation. I think, again, thanks to everyone on Zoom. And we look forward to seeing everyone at the next Connect conversation. For anyone who can make it, please join us at the reception. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.